Hi, and good evening. At least it's evening where I am. To all of you, thanks for joining me for the third and last of the talks that I'll be sharing with all of you. Um, I'm just going to jump straight in and share screen and go through lose video and get started. Um, yeah, part three of three, realizing discourse on the becoming of meaning and the mediation of social reality by information architecture and use. How did we get here? It began with the observation of the likeness between the formal composition of meaning by information architecture and discursive design, and how discursive design brings credibility to the argument that conceptual IAs carry meaning internal to objects destined for placement in the world. But by the close of part two, we somehow ended on a somewhat gloomy note. Contrived ontology was introduced as a theory to explain how an internal meaning for an object can transcend its form to become meaning in social reality by way of its use. This felt like an up note, right? And then I did this. Um, when that which is entailed by design objects being in the world is socially accepted, so too is the contrived ontology accepted as a construct within social reality. In other words, use is tacit acceptance. So what happens when makers don't realize there is meaning in their IA in their work, and when users don't realize that use is a tacit acceptance of that meaning in society? And then I finally did this. In a nutshell, you get what you got. What the hell kind of way is that to end a talk? Ah, well, in my defense, no one ever said moral and ethical imperatives are fun at a party. This talk should be understood as one emerging from a second culture view of IA that number one recognizes the moral and ethical implications of an acknowledgement of the work of meaning making, tacit or otherwise, performed by IA. And secondly, the opportunity afforded by IA towards addressing the well-known and long-standing criticism of critical discourses, that while fully capable of critiquing our constructed realities, they lack in their ability to translate ideal states into pragmatic plans capable of reconstructing better realities. It should be noted that they don't really have to, as such. Anyway, this is the abstract to my dissertation, which I completed in 2021, and I want to read a little bit of it to you. Within its scope, the study reveals that IA, as reframed, can be understood as operating tacitly within design and the world, and that which contains and transmits socio-ontological meaning, decoded, recoded, and encoded in design. Furthermore, CIA, conceptual information architecture, conducted in ideation, provided the concept for a social systems solution. IA and design developed to realize the concept as blueprints, described how use of the system in the world triggers a transformation and transcendence of this concept. In use, the IA of the concept being embedded within the structural form of the designed object comes to be a new socio-ontological phenomenon. In this way, a speculative theoretical account is given for how an instrumental ontological mediation of social reality may occur, at scale by IA employed in design. A couple of weeks later, hey, now that you grasp the concept of structural logic and semantic formation, does the manner in which they transport meaning into the world as a minimal contrived ontology and maximal contrived ontology make more sense? That is, the meaning is made manifest and realized in the use of an object and system. Yes, exactly. Once you see how structural logic and semantic formation encode meaning internally, that is minimal contrived ontology, it's clearer how that meaning then becomes maximal or socially enacted in real use. Here's a succinct restatement. Minimal contrived ontology, the internal intended meaning built into the object system by way of structural logic and semantic formation. Essentially, the blueprint of meaning, how the design thinks it should be interpreted. Maximal contrived ontology, the meaning as it actually materializes in the social world when people interact with or inhabit the system. That same internal meaning doesn't just stay in the blueprint, but is realized in real practice, shaped by cultural contexts, personal experiences, and communal discourse. So the transport of meaning from minimal to maximal contrived ontology is precisely the move from design intent, the IA's underlying structure and semantics, to lived reality, use, social adoption, and collective sense making. Structural logic and semantic formation create a potent coded foundation, but that foundation only becomes fully real once users engage, interpret, and embed it in their everyday social environment. That's it. Woo! Brilliant. Glad it resonated. The moment you see how structural logic and semantic formation collectively encode the intended meaning, the minimal contrived ontology, and then watch that meaning become socially activated, the maximal contrived ontology, it all clicks into place. Enjoy celebrating the conceptual aha moment. If anything else crops up, just ask, dude, you just stole my idea. I can't steal. I don't exist. After several tranquilizers and a therapy session, we continue from where we left off. Yeah, I'm fine now. Thanks for asking. I'd like to connect the concepts of contrived ontology and realizing discourse. What you got for me? Contrived ontology. This term from Fenn and Hobbs in 2019 suggests that the IA you create, its categories, its labels, its interrelationships, actively construct a reality or ontology for your audience. In other words, structural logic and semantic formation together produce a designed worldview within the artifactal system. Realizing discourse. By acknowledging that IA mediates reality for particular ends, you show how a conceptual IA can be deliberately leveraged to sustain or challenge existing social narratives, beliefs, or behaviors. Hence, a clear articulation of both structure and meaning can reveal how the design might reinforce certain perspectives or invite critical rethinking. That last bit, it's really important. You don't got to say it, bro. Who are you? Realize. Taken from the Oxford Languages Dictionary, um, there are two kinds or senses in which the word realizing can be used. The first is to become aware, become fully aware of something as a fact, or to understand clearly. He realized his mistake at once. Or the second sense of realizing, to make real, caused to happen. His worst fears have been realized. Or to achieve something desired or anticipated, as in fulfill. It's only now that she's beginning to realize her potential. The image alongside is taken from the dissertation that I read the abstract to you from earlier, um, is presented to you. And it illustrates where, in the first instance of the design project enacted for the research project, the dual concepts of realizing discourse emerged. That would be the one and the two. Um, while these dual occurrences emerged within a single design execution, their timing would suggest that they could be used as standalone efforts for IA-based analyses in research and IA-led practice in design. Interestingly, you'll notice in the image that there are three levels that the design process went through. So at the bottom of the image, you see inquiry, ideation, and prototyping, and listed from 1 until 12 are the various different design activities that I performed. And the arc is showing how in inquiry and research, it begins at the object level, then moves into a systems level where a process of deconstruction begins, and then in the movement into a conceptual level, decoding through of the research data occurs. And this is when the first instance of realizing discourse happens. As the process moves upwards into 5, 6, and 7, and 8, this is the core of the ideation process and the strategic moment, and where recoding occurs. Then moving down the other side of the arc, moving from the conceptual level into the systems level, that's where encoding happens and the second instance of realizing discourse occurred. Moving further down into the systems level, then we see a reconstruction of what is intended for the world. And so it continues. What I'll take you through now is ideas that I'm playing with for how realizing in the first sense, the form of realizing where one becomes aware, might have a place in our general discussion. So we're on the left-hand side of this diagram, realizing discourse number 1. And I'm briefly going to take you through an experiment in using an information architecture-based analysis for research in a standalone manner. And I've been doing this with ChatGPT, as you could expect. This is basically just an introduction. Would you like to take a stab at an IA analysis of the concept of democracy, then applying the concepts of structural logic and semantic formation as it manifests across time and space as a pervasive or cross-channel IA? Below is a concise demonstration of how you might frame an IA analysis of democracy using blah, 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 blah. Big picture view. Democracy can be treated as a complex information environment that encodes certain principles, for example, equality, representation, rights, into social structures, for example, elections, legislative bodies, courts. Over centuries and across societies, these principles manifest differently, and yet the core design of democracy as a contrived ontology, a conceptual architecture meant to facilitate government by people, has remained. And so it goes on and on and on. So there's no time for me to kind of take you through the full analysis. I've created a PDF of the full conversation, which I'll share with Dan to share with all of you as soon as possible. It's far from perfect, but it isn't bad as a first experiment. And that's literally after just a few minutes of playing with the idea of an IA-based analysis of a concept and using an artificial intelligence to perform it. It's worth noting as well that I integrate institutional theory so as to provide some kind of social theory to underpin such an application of IA for research purposes. I then move on to look at whether or not ChatGPT might be able to start solutioning based on the IA. So I came up with two different I think 2 or 3, maybe just 2 problems to be found in democracies, which specifically looked at problems of meaning for ChatGPT to attempt to solve. It's pretty interesting, and I'd really love your feedback. So do take a look. Right. Moving on to the second form of realizing, realizing in the sense of to make real. I would like to discuss realizing discourse 2 on the prototype making side of the design project that I enacted. It's a case study where information architecture was applied in designing a solution to the problem of addiction in Johannesburg, South Africa. This work illustrates a conceptual IA developed as a transformative strategic solution while providing an instrumental, meaning-led outcome for recovering addicts. Allow me to demonstrate. most of the images that you'll be shown, which I will speak through, um, you will also find in a conference paper that I wrote about my dissertation work. It was a Cumulus conference, and the paper that I wrote was entitled Realizing Discourse's Strategic Design Solution to the Problem of Addiction. And it's on ResearchGate. You can see on the bottom left. You can go and read the whole thing if you want. I would understand if you didn't. Um, but it's the basis for what I'm going to tell you now. Quoting myself and my research partner, Terence Fenn, in essence, sense making and meaning making in information architecture are the processes of decoding and encoding in design thinking, where from a humanities and cultural studies perspective, contrived ontology is understood as a subjective, constructed reality embedded in design artifacts and systems. The the conceptual framework for the overall process was to look at the development of an information architecture concept during ideation in dealing with a wicked problem, addiction being a wicked problem. Coming up with this IA concept was understood to occur during ideation, where making sense of a bunch of research and conceptualizing solutions as meaning making would be resolved as an inaction of conceptual information architecture, and in so doing would present a contrived ontology. You've seen this image before. The pink purple box in the middle is indicating that this is the moment in that process where that central circle was in the previous diagram, where 5, 6, 7, and 8 indicate the reframe that was enacted, coming up with a design strategy, what I called the recovery wellness concept and the recovery wellness journey. This is where the conceptual information architecture was done. And this conceptual information architecture was sort of bracketed as something occurring inside a strategy design. That first moment that I chatted about, item number 5, the reframe, this occurred in a really interesting way. I've been working through a synthesis of all the research data using that image on the left, a mandala. It's a particular tool that you can use in design. And what you're seeing here is a mistake I made. I'd been drawing this mandala multiple times. And in the center of the mandala had been the word addiction all the way through. And what it was reflecting was how internally I had framed my understanding of the whole problem of addiction as being about addiction. In other words, the problem of addiction is psychoactive substances or certain addictive behaviors such as gambling. And then I made a mistake. By accident, at the center of the image, I wrote 1, the human condition. And then I came back a few days later and I looked at the diagram and I realized this is a slip of the tongue. This is a Freudian kind of accident where the reframe had spilled out into the graphic. And so I rewrote addiction as if to correct myself, and then realized, hang on, this isn't about addiction. This whole thing is about the human condition. That then triggered this diagram, or the process that was enacted in this diagram. Up at the top, you see sense making, conceptual IA, and meaning making. That's reflected in that earlier diagram. You also see the moments where decoding, recoding, and encoding occurred. The same numbering system you can see in the middle that relates to the design activities at the bottom. On the right-hand side, there's a kind of a coding. What I'm saying here is that at the bottom, number 6, design strategy, where I was moving through the process of coming up with an aim, a concept, and approach. At the point of coming up with a concept, that's where the conceptual IA emerged. And it was here that I discovered a structural logic and semantic formation. And those were two different elements or aspects. The structural logic emerged from synthesizing and analyzing and then synthesizing a mountain of research that I'd done and ending up with what I called 5 strategic drivers. The way they're represented in the image on the left is in the background, you've got the need for placemaking and coherence. Above that, there is a need for awareness, knowledge, and advocacy. Another driver, which was networked personalization. And at the top, well-being. These 5 strategic drivers then needed to play out according to a new or a reconsidered customer life cycle, user life cycle for addiction. So the classic model of addiction begins where it says reaching out in this diagram, and that is basically use. Use becomes misuse, abuse, dependence, whereupon normally somebody goes to treatment. From treatment, they go into recovery. And once you're in recovery, there are only 2 options. Either you relapse, and from relapsing, you go back into treatment, or somehow you just stay clean forever. Now, the problem with that model is it's a binary one. It says you can only ever be using or clean in recovery. The whole idea that perhaps this might be a process as opposed to a matter of states is a very, very new concept. The new semantic formation follows a new recovery journey, which is about reaching out, and that's not necessarily the addict reaching out for help. It's the organization that I was helping, who are called UACT, the Ubuntu Addiction Community Trust, reaching out to people. When people become addicted, dependent on substances, and they do go into treatment, they're immersed in a new way of thinking about addiction and recovery in addiction. As part of that immersion process, recovering addicts are then engaged to define and design their own idea of what recovery looks like. Then they move into a space of wellness. The moment of wellness, if they fall out of wellness or well-being, it's not a matter of, oh, you fell off the wagon, you have to go back into treatment, you're a terrible person, which is usually how one is made to feel. It's not about going into treatment to get clean again. It's about reconnecting with your idea of what wellness means and being supported in that process by a whole system which UACT builds around its recovering addicts. In more formal terms, these systems are called recovery-oriented systems of care. And I don't want to go into too much detail. Suffice to say that it is a totally different semantic formation for what it means to be in addiction and to be in recovery. At the heart of it, though, is an important shift. And the shift is this, that ultimately the solution to addiction is finding radical meaning in life. In other words, one is always susceptible to going back into active use. Or stated otherwise, what is the one thing that would make you wake up in the morning and not use? The only thing that could really be is something that holds more meaning than using. Now, that is an extreme kind of um, case or example, but it's relevant and it resonates with people who, perhaps only with people who understand what it means to be truly addicted. And it is a radical proposition. It suggests things such as if you if you know it or if you don't, if the reason why you are currently in addiction is because your marriage to a particular man is so painful to you, psychologically painful to you, it is probably worth it for you to walk away from that marriage, possibly even your children, if the only thing that's going to keep you alive, because the drugs and the alcohol, they will kill you if you don't stop. You need to move into a space where you can find some other form of meaning if you wish to live. It really and truly is a life and death thing. And this is a radical, like the most extreme version of understanding this concept. Coming back to the more information architecture aspects of how this could play out. Already you see message form and message content being presented here. The reason being there is a discourse at play here. It is that explanation that I was trying to give you of a rethinking of addiction and recovery. There is a shift in the discourse. This image is, think of it as a poster to support the concept and the strategy which I came up with for the Ubuntu Addiction Community Trust. I refer to it as the recovery wellness concept. And herein you can see on the left-hand side, the relationship model aspect, and the right-hand side, the experience drivers. On the left, the relationship model is called a system of well-being, a system of meaning. And on the right, the experience drivers, a system to be well in, a meaningful system. These two then constitute on the left a semantic formation or a message form, and on the right, a structural logic and message content. We're now moving in that arc diagram away from that very top point off to the right. And here is the first example of how the structural logic and the semantic formation start to fuse at the strategic level. So at the top, you can see a linearized version of that life cycle model that I showed you a moment ago. And the same kind of keywords are up there: reaching out, immersion, define and design, wellness, and re-engaging. Beneath that, you've got what we refer to in design as a user journey or a customer journey, and the color coding that I spoke you through earlier. So in the background, those 5 vertical kind of columns are showing placemaking and coherence happening in the background, and then a bit more detail around what could constitute ideas of experiences, content, functionality, etc., for the experience drivers of awareness, knowledge, and advocacy, network personalization, and well-being. So there's a move through awareness efforts, knowledge building, advocacy efforts, presenting knowledge and immersion, tools available for early well-being during immersion, and that concept of personalized network personalization, which is recovery services and exploring a network to see what's available around you. Define and design is, again, now we start to get deep into well-being, defining, coming up with a My Recovery plan, identifying and starting to use recovery tools, getting coaching from a recovery coach, and expanding one's network. Then starting to use monitoring tools and engaging with relapse management. If one does relapse, that is a managed process. You can move back into awareness, knowledge, and advocacy to re-engage with understanding what recovery wellness is, and then redefining and redesigning, improving one's plan with the support of coaches and other people. From wellness, re-engaging can take three forms, either redesigning, redefining, or re-immersing as three re-entry points back into the process. What you're seeing now is a zooming in to the immersion phase. You can see that up in the top. And on the right-hand side, moving from the immersion phase into define and design. Here, in the define and design, that slither on the far right, those are all hooks that lead somebody into the define and design experience. On the immersion side, though, starting on the left, you can see quite detailed examples of content functionality, etc. So in our approach, we want to talk about things like recovery management and the third force, recovery wellness, and new thinking. Some explication of how things work, a recovery-oriented system of care, diagnosing misuse and addiction, the Collins model, I don't want to go into detail on that, and concepts like navigating recovery. Then introducing people to the kind of knowledge network and communities that are available to them. The idea that there is a global community, creating a research center, mutual aid networks, clinical health networks, medical health networks, and on it goes. A really, really key point here is the thing that we discussed last week and the week in the last presentation and before, which is the manner in which a conceptual information architecture can exist in pervasive information architectures. Well, that it can exist in and of itself. That was the example of the Holy Trinity, but that it can also exist and be transported as a meaning that could sit inside a pervasive information architecture, which would occur at the systems level, or in objects which make up a system, which could be, something like the cross on the wall in the example that I gave you, the medieval depiction of Christ on the cross. So here we see a conceptual IA developed up at the top where the first Roman numeral I is, and then repeating again at the systems level where the second numeral is, and then at the third object level. To put this into examples of the different kinds of design activities that took place, at the concept level, number 7, the recovery wellness concept, that was the first strategic nailing down of the idea. Moving onwards, number 8, the first version of the recovery wellness journey. That was followed by doing a whole bunch of concept development and exploring and expanding those first initial ideas. Then number 10, we're now in the systems level. Number 10, redrawing the recovery wellness journey, a version 2 version, and showing it at a lot more in a lot more detail at a lot more granular level. Then down at the object level, I came up with a solution landscape, which the purpose of which was to make sure that I was coming up with ideas for prototypes from across the full set of ideas that came up in the concept development phase, all the way down to number 12, where I was doing low fidelity prototyping, sketches, and the image that I'm showing you here is a sketch for an interface for the UAC website. And you'll notice the color coding all the way through. The reason why I'm showing the color coding is to make the point that if you want to develop out a concept, that you need to have this golden thread running through the design process so that the structural logic and semantic formation never fall apart. And in fact, that you can continue their fusion, working and thinking more closely about how they need to interact, because this is what enables that second instance of realizing discourse. Ta-da! And that's where we are. This was broken down further into realizing discourse being described as coming up with an architectonic. Firstly, an encoding within the prototyping work, and reconstructing through coming up with ideas how the landscape of addiction might play out in Johannesburg. So zooming in, not too much more to go. Hang in there with me. We've now zoomed in really, really close. You can see the define and design journey up at the top left, and the movement into the wellness journey. And here you've got examples. Each one of these circles represents a node in the system that is being developed, which is doing two things. In a linear way, it represents that kind of customer journey or the recovery wellness journey, where you see define your recovery. In the middle, design your recovery plan being in place. Examples of defining your recovery, for instance, definitions and measuring recovery, defining concepts like your kokorozashi and ma. It'll take too long to describe that. Determining what your values are, and then using tools like a value analysis helper. When you're creating your discovery plan, you've got planning tools, your recovery coach, finding one, working with one, perhaps becoming one yourself, understanding your recovery support services, what's available to you in your neighborhood, as it were, growing a support network, going to recovery school, etc. So this is kind of what the process looked like, moving from ideation and then ideation into prototyping, and then into the world. In ideation, the theory is we're looking at a structural logic and semantic formation, which was described as a system of well-being and a system to be well in. This was at a conceptual level of abstraction. Moving one level down from ideation into prototyping, we see the first instance of the minimal contrived ontology. This could be described as a system of meaning and a meaningful system. This now being at the concept, in the bleed between the concept and systems level. Then into prototyping, we see a further iteration of the minimal contrived ontology, something which I refer to as each instance in the whole and the whole in each instance. This is now between the systems and object level of abstraction. And finally, the last element, which is if this were to be in the world, a maximal contrived ontology, which loops back up to the description that was identified in ideation, a system of well-being and a system to be well in, which exists and is enacted at the object level. So a system of meaning and a meaningful system. This was how I chose to try and visualize the concept of each instance in the whole and the whole in each instance, which is to say that if you want a system to have meaning as intended, it has to be a yin and a yang. It's not enough that you have a top-down emphasis on some or other part or a bottom-up equivalent. It really needs to be a gestalt whole that can be experienced at any moment in your recovery, in that cycle, in the life cycle, which surrounds you, right? That's pretty much the idea. So the key in that diagram that I showed you earlier makes this point that the whole, which is constituted as parts which add up to sums, the sum works when you've got your experience drivers and the relationship model co-constituting the whole. And that visually is exactly what's going on here. The darker black rings indicate the recovery wellness journey and semantic formation. And the colored areas show how across every single moment, you've got those experience drivers enacted and the structural logic at play. Bring this all together, what you end up with is an actionable discourse, which they said critical discourse couldn't do until information architecture arrived. So that's it, folks. It's all I got at the moment. Please email Dan all the questions you have about my talks. I look forward to trying my best to help in answering them in our live face-to-face session planned for next week. Until then, happy days, and thank you so much for your time.